Hi, my name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Innovation Showcase. The main purpose of this ongoing series is to inform viewers about exciting innovations and creative individuals across the fields of business, science, technology, education, and the arts. Today via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guests Leslie Starobin and Pete Bilderback. Leslie is an artist, photographer, and Professor Emerita of Art at Framingham State University. And Pete is a communications specialist and writer at Brown University's Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. They're both here today to inform us about Leslie's very powerful, moving, and extremely informative exhibition entitled Looming in the Shadows of Lodz, which is on display at the Watson Institute until May 30th. Part of the Art at Watson initiative, Looming in the Shadows of Lodz, is based on Leslie and her family's 2019 trip to Poland, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Lodz. Leslie's photographic journey features contemporary photographs together with captions obtained from Leslie's mother-in-law, Tola, and Tola's sister, Dorka, both of whom were survivors of the Holocaust. During the program, we'll find out why and how the exhibition came about. We'll go on a behind-the-scenes tour and in the process come to better understand and appreciate the atrocities of the Holocaust, Leslie's artistry, and the value and importance of personal narratives as a means of better understanding, appreciating, and connecting to the past. Let's start by meeting Leslie and Pete, and then hearing all about Looming in the Shadows of Lodz. Welcome. So delighted you're both able to be here.
Happy to be here.
Thank
Leslie,
you for inviting.
Leslie,
Yes,
it was
very much.
wonderful finding out a little earlier in another program about your work, eager to find out about this exhibition and have you inform viewers. Would you please start by sharing with us why and how your roots journey to Poland came about, who was involved, some of the logistics, please?
Looming in the Shadows of Lodz, as you know, is right now on exhibition at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And I'm very honored that the Art at Watson Committee selected the work. So let's go. Whoops, sorry, I think, okay, this happened the last time one. All right. My family and I traveled to Poland on the 75th anniversary of our relatives' deportation to Auschwitz-Birkenau from the Lodz ghetto, the last ghetto to be liquidated by the Nazis in August 1944. As you can see in the two film stills on screen, my husband in the top left carried an iPad with a copy of a Polish diary his aunt penned at war's end, and a letter his mother wrote to him 40 years after she and her two sisters were liberated from the camps. My daughter, who you see in the bottom film still, followed with her iPad and sketchbook, later creating a series of paintings of the entryway of the apartment in the ghetto where her grandmother and great aunts lived under Nazi occupation. Throughout, my son videotaped our journey while I photographed places of familial memory and trauma as they appear in Poland today. My photographs from the trip, as you know, are on an exhibition at Brown University at the Watson Institute. Before our trip, my husband's Aunt Dorka, whom you see on screen, was instrumental in drawing up a list of addresses and places we needed to visit in Lodz, their birthplace, and the city is pronounced Łódź in Polish. A cogent nonagenarian, she's the only relative alive today to contribute to this multi-generational project. From Poland, the four of us flew directly to Israel, where she lives. She pored over our imagery, revealing new memories of the past as my son, her great-nephew, filmed her. The quote on screen from the director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum encapsulates the essence of this project, so I wanted to include it. Nobody and nothing can replace the survivors. We should reflect on this question and think about how these people can be used while they're with us and about what they do in a unique way. It's the power of their stories that's so important. And I was already working on this project before I found this particular quote, but in many ways, it really shaped our journey in this particular project. And if you have the opportunity to visit the Watson Institute and see the show, there's a QR code on the wall next to the artist statement where you can access Dorka's testimony, which is called Marching All Night.
Were there any particular stories from Tola or Dorka that influenced the way you framed your photographs?
Yes, let's start with this picture, which Art and Watson chose as their public relations, I guess, image. And so, stirred by my mother-in-law and Dorka's stories, I stood in the backyard at Liminskiago 48, the address where they lived in the ghetto under Nazi occupation, from May 1940 to August 1944. I entered a dark foyer and climbed a creaky staircase up 2 flights. I discovered a windowsill deep enough for a child to perch and read. Years ago, Dorka told me that she passed many hours sitting in a windowsill, often reading a book to assuage her hunger. I framed the wide open porthole in my viewfinder, focusing on a leafy green in the center of the yard, the tree roots buried in a plot of land whose history is invisible to the people who live there now. To us, trespassers, the yard would be just a yard without the sisters' memories. I pressed the shutter. Weeks later, in Jerusalem, I showed Dorka the picture, and she commented, "There were no trees, no greenery. 80 years. I'd just like to add there were no trees and no greeneries because the people living in the ghetto needed to cut the trees down for firewood to heat their apartments, and also the little bit of food that they received in their rations from the Germans. If you look closely at this picture, and I'm just going to use my cursor right here, you see a building in the backyard. There's nothing in this image, which I called A Tree Grows in Bauti, or there's nothing within the frame, I should say, that reveals the horrific events the Altman family experienced here in September 1942. In order to learn what happened here, you have to view the photo narrative, which hangs next to this picture in the exhibit. And if I can speak about this one for a couple of minutes. Commanded by the Nazis to line up in the backyard, the family heard for the first time 2 words in German, recht, links. We didn't understand the meaning of right, left, Dorka recalled. We'd never heard those words. We didn't know what a selection was. It'd be another 2 years before the Nazis would liquidate the ghetto, before the Altman family would hide in the Lodz Jewish cemetery, then report to the Radicast train station, where they crowded into cattle cars en route to an unknown destination. You can follow their journey when viewing the exhibit, but this particular image was very emotional. I'm sorry.
Speaking of that topic, what was the most emotionally impactful moment for you during the trip?
I'm not sure there was one most emotionally impactful moment. I think that if you asked all 4 of us, there would be a different answer to that particular question. But I selected, knowing you were going to ask me this question, I selected this image of the interior of one of the cattle cars that stands on the train tracks at the Radagast train station today. There is a small memorial there. And I think for all of us, knowing what happened inside the cattle car and my mother-in-law's memories, and she talks about that. You see her words, or her memories here were in forefront in our minds. And in a letter that she wrote to my husband, her firstborn, she described exactly what happened in the cattle car in her memory. And she talked about 100 people in an animal car where there was only room for 30 people. Everything was very compressed. And see, she said it was hell, no water, no air. There was only one little window. Children were crying. Older people were fainting, falling, dying. No air. Gehenom, which is hell. After 2 days, the train stopped. Abba went to the window, and Abba is Hebrew for father. And so I think this very compressed space, and when we entered it, I think we all felt the gravity of the experience and the moment.
Most definitely, unfathomable. Can you share more about how you incorporated the diary of Devorah Altman into the exhibition?
Sure. Amazingly, Dorka had told us over the years that, but she'd written a little diary after the war, and, she didn't, I asked her once, do you know where it is? She said, I don't know what happened to it. And, as things happen, in 2017, a relative, actually her son, through another scholar in Poland, located a typed copy of the diary in the archives of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. And when we were in Poland, we had a chance to view the journal. The original handwritten teenage penned notebook is lost. And the typeface that they used, in the 1940s, we believe it's the late 1940s, to type the diary, inspired the font that I selected to use for the work. But I had the diary translated. They gave me a PDF copy from Polish to English. So that became another roadmap map for our journey. Although at the time we received the diary, we didn't know for sure that we were going to be going to Poland. So it was really, a gift. So after the trip, I selected quotes from the diary, which, as I mentioned, was written in July 1945 when Dorka was 15. And in this excerpt, she graphically describes the hunger in the ghetto. And I'll read part of this to you and then just explain what my thought process was in pairing these two images. No one cared for the sick. No one cried for the dead, because who could shed a tear from others when they were crying for themselves? The palatial family tomb in the frame, it's from 1900, is atypical of Jewish burial graves, but it alludes to an era before the war, before hunger in the ghetto wiped out entire families, to a time in the mid to late, 19th and early 20th century, when the city of Lodz, as I mentioned, was called Łódź in Polish, prospered manufacturing textiles and clothing almost all of Eastern Europe. In June 2019, when I clicked the camera shutter, I recorded yet another epic in the history of the cemetery, which was once considered the largest Jewish cemetery in all of Europe. So it's a fusion of time periods when you're looking at this particular image. And I can say a little bit more about the process.
Yeah, would you, because it's quite fascinating. How do you envision and go about creating your artwork?
So in the next couple of slides, I can show you that. I mean, in this particular one, it was this palatial family tomb, and she's talking about during the war, entire families. If you continue to read on here, whole families died in this fashion from hunger. So I was standing there, I took this photograph, and it's the ruins of what looks like once a very palatial tomb, yet the experience of the Jews 40 years later was quite different. And after the trip, I examined the images and I realized that when I framed the scenes in the viewfinder, the voices of the individuals who experienced these places in the event firsthand were forefront in my mind. And I began to think about inscribing the sisters' memories of the war years around the borders of the pictures. I didn't know when I went to Poland that was going to be what I would do in the end. Afterwards, I coined, these hybrid compositions where I intertwine textual memory with visual space, photo narratives. For this series, I made a deliberate decision to render all the sites I photographed in color. A grayscale palette would have blurred the distinction between the past, as delineated in the words on paper, and the present as depicted in the photographs. And I wanted a clear demarcation between the past and the present. Even though when you look at this image, you can imagine it in black and white because there's so little color in it. And the color doesn't play any significant emotional or descriptive role. But in the images from Auschwitz-Birkenau, and in many of the other images, the color signifies, specifically at the death camp, more than just the present tense. It says something about the pastoral setting of the death camp in Southwest Poland. At Birkenau, the historian Daniel Reynolds writes in Postcard from Auschwitz, quote, "The trees and fields enclosed industrial mass murder in a bucolic frame." So that was one of the reasons that I thought it was really important to work in color. And in this particular image, which I entitled The Ruins of Crematorium 2, Auschwitz-Birkenau, the picture depicts reddish-brown rubble in gray cement and gray cement. The lifeless hues contrast with shoots of post-war greenery in a pale blue sky. While the title and image describe what I observed in June 2019, the words on paper evoke the era when the crematorium still operated. What I did not know, we did not know what was burning, recalled 15-year-old Dorka in her diary. And when I created this image, I don't think I did it intentionally and it was subconscious, but all the words line up with the actual ruins of the crematoria. Later, Tola confirmed her sister's belief. Before we left Auschwitz, we sat 50 meters from the furnace, and somebody told us that they were burning people there, and we didn't believe it.
Leslie, in the couple of minutes we have left, what are some of the challenges you face in translating such a deeply personal and historical narrative into this art exhibition?
Well, there were many challenges. First of all, except for the Polish diary, all the other material written and conversations that I really recorded over decades, particularly my mother-in-law, but but Dorka as well, they were speaking Hebrew. So the first thing we had to do is to translate the Hebrew to the English, and my husband is luckily, his first language is Hebrew. My first language is English, but neither one of us are professional translators. So this was a very difficult learning process because we wanted to be true to how they express themselves, but to use words in the English language that were the most appropriate. And even the structure of sentences in the two languages is so different. So we spent a lot of time, once I chose selections that I wanted, working on the actual translation. And the same thing happened in the testimony, which is all in Hebrew. And that involved my son, who's, filmed it and was the editor. And so it was a three-way process at that point. But there was obviously the challenge of selecting the specific quotes, but another challenge was, and I picked this image to point this out, was pairing the narrative text with a specific image. Some of the matches were obvious, others were not. And I read this over in my mother-in-law's statement. She said this many years ago. We were 1,000 women in there. And I wasn't planning initially to use this particular quote, but I did want to tell the story of this Hungarian woman and honor her, who truly saved the life of my mother-in-law and her two sisters. They lost their mother. But my mother-in-law said there's 1,000 women in there. And I'm looking at this picture of Barak on my screen. And I'm like, people kind of need to be thinking about, you're standing there, you're visiting there, you have their voices in your head. And if you don't have your own family members' voices in your head, you have a guide who's telling other people's stories. And it was very sort of specific. And the additional challenge was this story ends up taking 4 pictures to tell the story. And I had to decide whether I wanted to do that. And then at the Watson, where, the space was very particular to the architecture of the space, how do we tell it? And of course, the installers had a great idea about putting these images up in a compressed space, 2 across, 2 up and down.
Well, speaking of the curating of the exhibition, let's move on. And Pete, welcome. So delighted to be able to be here. Would you please start by sharing your role in co-managing the exhibition?
Sure. And thank you again for having me. And Leslie, thank you for your explanations and your stories. And I just want to say it's been a real honor for me to work on this exhibition with you. Very proud of the work that we've done together. But to answer your question, Jay, I first need to just talk a little bit about what Art at Watson is. And as you mentioned, it's an initiative of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And actually, we're soon to be, as of July 1st, the Thomas J. Watson Jr. School of International and Public Affairs. So Art at Watson is made up of a committee of Watson faculty, staff members, Brown students, and members of the community. And our goal is to, through art, support the Institute's mission to promote a just and peaceful world through research, teaching, and public engagement. And the way it works is we receive applications from artists via an online forum, and that's how we connected with Leslie. And when an application comes in, the committee reviews it, and the first question that we ask is, is this exhibition consistent with the Institute's mission? And if the answer to that is yes, we ask if the artwork is interesting and whether it's feasible for us to display it. And in Leslie's case, the answer was, definitely a resounding yes to both those questions. And because Leslie's subject matter was personally interesting to me, I agreed, along with Veronica Ingham, who's a senior fellow here at Watson, to manage the exhibition. And so the first thing that we had to decide was what the most appropriate space to exhibit her work would be. And I think here it's just important for me to point out that we're not actually a museum and we don't have a dedicated gallery where people go for the specific purpose of viewing artwork. But we do have access to a handful of spaces in Watson's building where artwork can be exhibited. So for Leslie's artwork, we decided that the best place for it was the agora of what's called Stephen Robert 62 Hall. It's a large, very modern building. It's a lot of glass, very white. Some students here at Brown jokingly refer to it as the Apple Store. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. So from there, we worked with Leslie to plan the exhibition. We showed her the space and tried to figure out how many of her works we could display and developed a rough idea of how the exhibition would look in the space. I also worked on publicity. I put together a press release and wrote an article about the exhibition. And I made a lot of contacts in the community who could help spread the word. And we also planned an opening reception and hoped the weather would cooperate, which it mostly did. And it's a lot of work, but it's definitely really rewarding. And I get a lot of help from the rest of the committee. So the process really wasn't very stressful for me, especially because we have members of the committee who have done this many times before, especially Joanne Hart and Christy Kilgus, who are the committee's co-chairs. They just really know how to get all the things we need to do done. And I also knew that hanging and displaying the artwork would be in good hands because we have two very talented committee members, Carl Smith and Sarah Baldwin, and they have a tremendous amount of experience with hanging artwork and they know the spaces. And as Leslie can attest, they know how to work with the artists to kind of bring their vision to life in the best possible way within the space that we have.
Pete, as you know, the exhibition coincides with the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. How does this timing shape its significance?
Yeah, so that was really just a coincidence, I would have to say, because if we had gotten Leslie's application last year or if we got it next year, we still would have wanted to exhibit her artwork. But it was fortuitous in the sense that there is some activity going on here at Brown related to that, including a conference organized by Omer Bartov, who is the Dean's Chair of Holocaust and Genocide Studies here at Brown. And I know that Leslie's going to be working with him a bit on that. So we're always looking for ways to tie our exhibitions in with other things that are happening at Brown.
Were there any particular stories or images that personally resonated with you during the curation process?
Yeah, well, what I would say is the whole exhibition is just tremendously moving, and I think part of its power lies in the cumulative effect of it, and your ability to follow the personal narratives as they're related to these horrific events and the aftermath of them. But if I had to single one out, I'd say it's the photo of the gate at Auschwitz, which, when you translate it into English, says "work sets you free." And it's framed by text from Leslie's mother-in-law that says, "A Jewish capo is telling us quietly, everyone is healthy, everyone is young. If not, here is a window directly to heaven." So there's really multiple layers of irony at work in this image. Um, Obviously, the prisoners being ushered into a death camp were anything but free. And then there's this kind of heartbreaking quote from the capo, which itself is a very fraught position where the lines
Mm,
between collaborator, perpetrator, and victim are
yeah.
very blurred. So here, when he talks very euphemistically about a window directly to heaven, which when you put it like that, it almost sounds like a kind of freedom, but not the kind of freedom that any of us wants.
Most definitely, most definitely. In just a few words, what do you think makes Leslie's work so compelling?
Well, um, I think that with any major historical event, there's an inflection point where the event passes from living memory, and we're very near that inflection point with the Holocaust right now. So I think it's just especially important for us to keep the stories of those who experienced it alive. And Leslie's work is really important for doing it, but it's also really powerful for the way it demonstrates how the trauma associated with those events gets passed down through generations. So the relatives of survivor experience their own lived trauma in a variety of ways, and Leslie's work speaks really very powerfully to that.
Very briefly, I know there's been a lot of feedback and comments already about the exhibition, but just a couple of words with this regard, please.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll just share an anecdote. After we finished hanging the artwork, there were two male undergraduate students who saw what we were doing, and we saw them looking at every photo very carefully. And when they were done, I asked them what they thought, and they said, "This is really powerful." And that's precisely the response we're hoping for and seem to be getting.
And just working on that thought, what do you hope the impact might have on Brown students and the broader community?
Well, I think one of the strengths of our model is the fact that we put artwork in everyday working spaces and we can catch people unaware. And I hope a lot of people have the same kind of reaction that those two students had, where they find something really moving and thought-provoking that they weren't expecting. When you go to a museum, you're kind of expecting to be moved by artwork. You're
Mhm.
prepared for that. And not that this is better or worse than that, but I do like the fact that we can surprise people and interrupt their daily routine. And, especially with this exhibition, we just don't want these events to be forgotten, and we want people to relate to them on a personal level.
In our closing credits, we'll have additional information about program relating to the exhibition, current and upcoming plans for art at Watson. But for now, unfortunately, we have to end our conversation. It's been so informative. And as you said, Pete, incredibly powerful work, Leslie. Thank you for sharing it with us and informing us about this, as we said in the introduction, the atrocities of the Holocaust through your lens and the reflections of your relatives. Um, and the good word is it'll be on display until May 30th. So definitely encourage people to make their way to the Watson Institute. Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.